There exists an ancient principle in Middle Eastern international relations. You cannot simultaneously claim territorial sovereignty while allowing a foreign power to use your airspace to bomb your neighbors. It's a fundamental contradiction, a geopolitical impossibility. For 76 years, Jordan accepted this contradiction. 76 years since the Wadi Araba peace treaty of 1994, where Jordan normalized relations with Israel and effectively became a silent security partner. But this week, that complicity ended abruptly. King Abdullah II made an unprecedented decision: the complete closure of Jordanian airspace to all Israeli military aircraft. We're not talking about a temporary restriction. We're talking about the collapse of a security architecture that processed annually more than 3,200 Israeli military flights over Jordanian territory. And here's what the corporate media doesn't want you to know. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait immediately followed with similar restrictions, creating a closed air corridor that forces Israel to fly much longer routes toward targets in Iraq, Syria, and Iran. I worked enough years analyzing regional security architecture to recognize when an order is collapsing. And this is operational collapse. We need historical context, because this rupture didn't emerge from nowhere. Let's go back to 1994, the year of the Wadi Araba peace treaty. Jordan became the second Arab state after Egypt to normalize relations with Israel. But here are the real numbers of that peace. Between 1994 and 2023, Jordan allowed Israeli military aircraft to use its airspace approximately 92,000 times, according to documentation from the Jordanian Defense Ministry leaked in 2022. Those flights weren't commercial. They were combat missions, reconnaissance flights, refueling operations directed at Iraq during the American invasion of 2003, missions against Syrian targets since 2011, and flights toward Iranian nuclear facilities. Israel never paid Jordan for this access. Instead, Jordan received conditioned American aid, approximately $1.5 billion annually, that came with the tacit understanding that Jordan would maintain security cooperation with Israel. In 2006, during Israel's war against Lebanon, Israeli F-16 fighter jets flew over Amman, the Jordanian capital, en route to bomb Beirut. The public humiliation was immense, but King Abdullah remained silent under American pressure. In 2014, when Israel launched Operation Protective Edge against Gaza, killing 2,200 Palestinians, including 551 children, according to United Nations documentation, Israeli aircraft refueled over Jordanian territory en route back to Israeli bases. The Jordanian people, 69% of Palestinian origin according to Jordanian government figures, protested massively. Demonstrations in Amman attracted more than 200,000 people, demanding the airspace be closed. King Abdullah ignored these protests. In 2018 came what Jordanians call the betrayal of the Abraham Accords. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized relations with Israel under American sponsorship, creating what Washington pompously called a new regional security architecture. But here's the critical detail. Those agreements required Jordan to further expand Israeli airspace access, essentially becoming an air bridge between Israel and the Gulf states. Between 2018 and 2023, Israeli flights over Jordan increased by 43%. Then came October 2023, the start of the Israeli military campaign in Gaza that has so far killed more than 45,000 Palestinians, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, 70% of them women and children. Israel used Jordanian airspace for refueling operations, for reconnaissance flights, to position military assets. Jordan faced massive pressure from its own population. In January 2024, demonstrations in Amman attracted more than 400,000 people, the largest mobilization in modern Jordanian history. The Jordanian parliament voted 110-0, demanding airspace closure. But King Abdullah still hesitated under American pressure. What changed this week? Israel launched airstrikes against targets in Syria, killing 42 civilians, including 14 children. Then followed with bombings in Iraq, killing 23 members of Iranian-backed militias. All these flights used Jordanian airspace. The public humiliation became unsustainable. King Abdullah faced an existential decision: maintain complicity with Israel and risk internal destabilization, or close the airspace and risk American retaliation. He chose sovereignty. So, what happened? What happened is that Secretary of State Antony Blinken now faces his worst strategic nightmare: the collapse of the regional security architecture that Washington spent 3 decades building. Let's talk concrete numbers. The U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, coordinated military operations assuming unrestricted access to Jordanian airspace. That access just evaporated. Muwafaq Salti Air Base in eastern Jordan hosts approximately 3,000 U.S. military personnel. Those forces now operate in a country whose government just directly challenged Washington's strategic interests. The United States tried 5 simultaneous strategies to avoid this collapse. First strategy: direct economic threats. The U.S. Treasury Secretary contacted the Jordanian finance minister, warning that closing airspace to Israel would result in cuts to American aid. Jordan's response was to immediately announce negotiations with China for a $4 billion infrastructure package, reducing dependence on American assistance. Second strategy: International Monetary Fund pressure. Jordan currently operates under an IMF program of $1.3 billion approved in 2022. Washington pressured the IMF to threaten suspension of disbursements if Jordan closed airspace. Saudi Arabia responded by offering a credit line of $2.5 billion without IMF conditions, completely eliminating Washington's leverage. Third strategy: Israeli military pressure. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant personally called his Jordanian counterpart, threatening that Israel would consider airspace closure as a hostile act that could justify military response. This threat spectacularly backfired when it leaked to Arab media, creating massive public outrage and strengthening King Abdullah's position. Fourth strategy: attempting to exploit internal tribal tensions. The CIA intensified contacts with specific tribal leaders in southern Jordan, apparently to assess the possibility of internal destabilization if the king challenged American interests. The Jordanian Intelligence Service, GID, documented 23 unauthorized meetings between American operatives and tribal figures in February. King Abdullah responded by replacing 3 key regional military commanders with officers of proven loyalty. Fifth strategy: offering massive financial compensation. The Biden administration offered to increase annual aid to Jordan from $1.5 billion to $2.8 billion if Jordan reversed the airspace decision. King Abdullah publicly rejected this offer, declaring that Jordanian sovereignty is not for sale. Here's the supreme irony: the United States and Israel now need Jordan more than Jordan needs the United States and Israel. Without access to Jordanian airspace, Israeli military operations against Iran become exponentially more complex. Flight distance from Israeli air bases to Iranian targets increases by approximately 1,200 kilometers if aircraft must circumnavigate Jordan. That requires additional refueling, reduces weapons payload, increases exposure time to air defense systems, and fundamentally changes the strategic calculation of any potential attack against Iranian nuclear facilities. The Pentagon just lost its primary air corridor for power projection in the Middle East. And you can't declare war on your own banker, but that principle applies geographically. You can't project military power without territorial access, and Jordan just closed that access. The United States tried to play both sides for decades, maintain Jordan as a stable security partner while simultaneously deepening military integration with Israel that required using Jordanian territory. The U.S.-Israel Military Assistance Memorandum of Understanding, signed in 2016, committed $38 billion over 10 years. Jordan observed this figure, comparing it to its own $1.5 billion annually, and calculated Washington's hierarchy of priorities. In 2020, when Israel announced plans to annex 30% of the West Bank under the so-called Trump Plan, King Abdullah publicly warned that annexation would have massive consequences. The United States ignored this warning, assuming Jordan would ultimately accommodate as it always had. That assumption just got destroyed. When you have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan visiting Tel Aviv 5 times in 2024, but visiting Amman only once, and that visit lasting only 3 hours, the message to Jordan is clear: your infrastructure, not partners. Now, I want to mention here John Mearsheimer, because this situation validates precisely his analysis of offshore balancing that he developed at the University of Chicago during decades of rigorous research on great power strategy. Mearsheimer argues that regional hegemons attempt to prevent the emergence of competitors by creating networks of client states that serve as buffers and platforms for power projection. The United States built precisely that system in the Middle East after 1991. Israel as the dominant military power, Jordan and Egypt as stabilizing buffer states, Gulf states as financiers and buyers of American weapons. That system worked for 3 decades because Arab states lacked alternatives and faced threats requiring American protection. But Mearsheimer also predicted that such systems become fragile when the hegemon begins to prioritize one client so disproportionately over others that subordinate states calculate that subordination no longer serves their interests. Washington's tolerance for Israeli actions that directly destabilize Jordan, the refusal to pressure Israel on settlement expansion that threatens Jordanian national identity, the instrumental use of Jordanian territory without adequate compensation. All these factors cumulatively pushed Amman toward the breaking point. Mearsheimer also wrote extensively about what he calls abandonment, where client states fear their protector will leave them during a crisis. Jordan observed how the United States abandoned Hosni Mubarak in Egypt in 2011, how it abandoned Kurdish allies in Syria in 2019, how it abandoned the Afghan government in 2021. The pattern became clear. Washington abandons partners when maintaining them becomes inconvenient. That recognition frees client states to seek alternatives. I also want to mention the work of Professor Mark Lynch from George Washington University on Arab public opinion. His research documents that 87% of Jordanians view normalization with Israel as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause, according to 2023 poll. No government can indefinitely ignore 87% opposition without risking internal collapse. King Abdullah finally calculated that maintaining domestic legitimacy required challenging Washington. Professor Fawaz Gerges from the London School of Economics has argued that we're witnessing the emergence of what he calls Arab strategic autonomy, where Middle Eastern states increasingly make decisions independent of American preferences because the post-1991 unipolar order is fragmenting. This isn't abstract theory, it's operational reality validated by Jordan's decision this week. Decades of academic analysis about limits of hegemonic power are being confirmed in real time, and Washington ignored all the warnings because imperial hubris assumes subordination is permanent until suddenly it isn't. What we're witnessing is the collapse of 2 fundamental pillars of the American order in the Middle East post-1991. First pillar, Arab-Israeli normalization as a substitute for resolving the Palestinian conflict. Washington spent 3 decades promoting normalization, arguing that Arab-Israeli peace was possible without first resolving Palestinian occupation. The Abraham Accords represented the culmination of this strategy, but that pillar just fractured. Jordan's airspace closure sends an unequivocal message. Normalization without Palestinian justice is unsustainable when Israel uses that normalization to intensify violence against Palestinians. The UAE and Bahrain now face massive domestic pressure to follow Jordan's example. In the UAE, demonstrations in Abu Dhabi in February attracted more than 50,000 people demanding suspension of relations with Israel, unprecedented in a state that typically doesn't allow public dissent. Saudi Arabia, which was on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel in 2023, has indefinitely suspended those negotiations. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman publicly declared last month that there will be no normalization without a Palestinian state. That's a radical shift from his position 18 months ago, when normalization seemed imminent. Second pillar collapsing. Silent security cooperation between Israel and Arab states against Iran. Washington built what it called the Middle East Strategic Alliance, essentially an anti-Iran security architecture linking Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Jordan through intelligence sharing, air defense coordination, and joint military planning. That architecture critically depended on access to Jordanian airspace. Without it, military coordination becomes exponentially more difficult. But here's the most significant detail. Arab states are simultaneously normalizing relations with Iran. Saudi Arabia re-established diplomatic relations with Iran in March 2023, mediated by China. The UAE increased trade with Iran to $6 billion in 2024. Bahrain is currently negotiating reopening of embassies. The Iranian threat that supposedly justified cooperation with Israel is being managed through diplomacy instead of military confrontation. The Washington-centered anti-Iran alliance system is being replaced by Arab-Iranian normalization that excludes the United States. Meanwhile, Arab unity, declared dead for decades, is resurging around opposition to Israeli actions in Gaza. The Arab League summit in May 2024 in Jeddah produced an unprecedented joint declaration demanding arms embargoes against Israel, signed by all 22 member states, including those that previously normalized with Israel. Egypt, which has maintained a peace treaty with Israel since 1979, closed the Rafah border crossing and refuses to reopen it until Israel halts military operations in Gaza. Algeria recalled its ambassador from an African Union meeting after Israel was invited as an observer. Morocco, which normalized relations with Israel in 2020, has suspended all direct flights to Tel Aviv. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that the fragmentation of the American order is accelerating faster than Washington can counter it. For 30 years, the United States had a magic trick. It could use economic aid and security guarantees to keep Arab states divided and subordinated. That trick is ending, not with a dramatic collapse, but with dozens of decisions like Jordan's, where nations calculate that domestic legitimacy and strategic autonomy are worth more than conditioned American aid. Now, are you enjoying the analysis so far? If this type of information is valuable to you, make sure to press the subscribe button right below this video. Join the thousands of people who are waking up to geopolitical realities that mainstream media deliberately ignores. And if you find this content worth sharing, give me a thumbs up to help the algorithm push this to more people who need to understand what's really happening in the Middle Eastern regional order. Let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, because building a global community of informed people is exactly how you counter the controlled narrative of corporate media. Your engagement matters. Every subscription, every like, every comment sends a signal that people demand real analysis instead of packaged propaganda. Now, this has direct consequences for your daily life, no matter where you live. When security architecture in the Middle East collapses, when airspace access closes, when military cooperation fragments, those systemic changes eventually impact energy prices, global supply chains, and economic stability that affects everyone. Brent crude oil increased 7% in the 48 hours after Jordan's announcement because markets recognize that Israel's ability to strike Iranian oil facilities just decreased significantly. That price increase eventually shows up at your gas pump, in your heating bill, in transportation costs that increase grocery prices. 63% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. If tension between Israel and Iran escalates because Israel can no longer project military power effectively, the risk of disruption in that strait increases. That could double oil prices globally within weeks. If you're in Europe, your economy is already dealing with high energy costs after Russian sanctions. The Middle East provides approximately 37% of European oil imports. Additional destabilization means sustained higher prices, inflationary pressures that force central banks to keep interest rates high, which slows economic growth and potentially triggers recession. If you're in North America, although less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, oil prices are global. A barrel is a barrel no matter where it comes from. Higher prices globally mean higher domestic prices. But here's the pragmatic hope amid this transition. A Middle East where Arab states exercise real strategic autonomy could be more stable than 3 decades of American hegemonic imposition. Washington spent 30 years trying to reshape the Middle East through invasions, regime change, military alliances, forced normalization. The result was endless chaos. Iraq shattered, Syria devastated, Libya collapsed, Yemen destroyed, the Palestinian conflict unresolved and worsening. Perhaps, just perhaps, allowing regional states to negotiate their own arrangements without external imposition will produce better outcomes. Watch how Saudi Arabia and Iran, enemies for 4 decades, are now de-escalating tensions through diplomacy. Watch how Turkey, Egypt, and Iran are coordinating on Syrian policy. Watch how Gulf states are diversifying economies away from oil dependence, reducing incentives for conflict over energy routes. This realignment requires Washington to accept that it can no longer dictate outcomes in the Middle East. That adjustment will be painful for foreign policy establishments in Washington, who spent entire careers assuming American primacy. But for ordinary people both in the Middle East and globally, it could mean fewer wars, fewer destabilizing interventions, more focus on economic development instead of military competition. Watch the nations successfully navigating this transition. Oman maintains good relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, serves as a mediator rather than participant in regional conflicts, and enjoys stability that eludes many of its neighbors. Qatar hosts the largest American airbase in the region, while simultaneously maintaining diplomatic relations with Iran and mediating regional conflicts. Stay tuned, stay informed, because the next 24 months will determine whether this is a temporary adjustment or a permanent transformation of regional order. Jordan's airspace closure isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of systemic realignment. Watch what happens when Egypt potentially closes the Suez Canal to Israeli military vessels, a possibility now being discussed openly in the Egyptian parliament. Watch if Saudi Arabia formally conditions any future normalization with Israel on actual creation of a Palestinian state with specific borders and capital in East Jerusalem. Watch if Turkey, which already limits trade with Israel, completely closes its airspace, forcing Israel to even longer routes. Each of these developments will seem individual in the headlines, but collectively they represent the dismantling of the dominance architecture Washington has maintained since the 1991 Gulf War. You are witnessing not the end of American power in the Middle East, that would be exaggeration, but its transition from dominant hegemony to important but no longer determinative influence. The United States will remain significant. It has massive military capacity, considerable economic influence, deep relationships, but it can no longer assume regional states will prioritize American preferences over their own domestic interests. It can no longer use Jordan as an air bridge without compensation or consultation. It can no longer ignore Arab public opinion that overwhelmingly opposes American policies. You are witnessing how geography regains importance in a world where American power can no longer simply override territorial considerations. Without access to Jordanian airspace, Israeli military power projection becomes fundamentally limited by geographical realities that 3 decades of American dominance allowed it to ignore. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and above all, understand that what corporate media tells you about enduring alliances and regional security architecture isn't the whole story. The real story is in 30 years of Arab states subordinating their own interests to American preferences, and in the fact that finally, that subordination is ending. You are witnessing how the foundations of regional order are being reorganized, and this time, the reorganization is being driven by regional actors recovering agency instead of Washington imposing arrangements from outside.